Sometimes things go live sooner than others. It's all good. I set them at approximately the same time. Anyway, hi everybody. I am back again, and I'm here with another exciting chapter of Guardian of the Sword. This time it's a bit meatier, so I've taken the liberty of being a little more relaxed. Um, I am, however, going to be fighting with my laptop because I didn't think to grab the charger for it. So hopefully I have enough time to get through this all. It's, let's see, 20 from page 125 to 142. So 8 pages shy of 50, or wow, I can't do math. 17 pages. There we go. Wow. Okay, just the brain today. I also need food. Why? Many people do this. Many people podcast, stream before they eat. I am one of those people. At any rate, for those of you who are just tuning in, my name is Beth, and I am currently reading my dad's manuscript. This one, there's many of them, but this one is The Guardian of the Sword, and it's the 1982 edition. The 1977 edition's already been published, but I saw this one, and now I kind of want to see the differences between the two and see if I made a horrible mistake or not. Who knows? But also I wanted to practice speaking to people. And yeah, so without further ado, because this is a lot to get through tonight, I present Chapter 17 of Guardian of the Sword. High in the rocks where the eagles scream, the Guardian enters the madman's dream. Armed with power in his right hand, goes he into the magic land. Behind he leaves the brown-tressed maid, Helena, the hill daughter, unafraid. Ahead do danger and death await, and what will be the Guardian's fate? From The Clearing of the Pass by Artur One-Eye of the Midland Plain. The next morning they went to the pass. It was a lengthy walk, and while they rested, Helena pointed out certain of the peaks and named them. Oh dear. The first sloped gently from its bottom, then more steeply, then leaped suddenly into a sheer pinnacle of snow-blanketed rock. This is the one we call Kinsegrit. Oh dear. Okay. This is the problem with only ever having read it without no pronunciation guide. I mean, there might be some, but I'd have to go into a lexicon. Long story. Okay. There's one we call Kinsech Grit Yoj, the white needle of rock. And there beside it, she pointed with another mini-rayed patch of snow on a purple face, there is Hnin Grit Skroy Troch, the star in the rock above the earth. Down between them runs Haral Griximba, the evil way through the rocks. Again, there's a lexicon about all of this. Continuing on their way, they soon stood before the great mirror, which spanned a great gap between two sheer cliffs. Near its base, directly at the point where the old path disappeared beneath it, was an inscription. At first glance, the letters were blurred and illegible. On closer inspection, however, they seemed to leap into brilliant life reading this way. This way is closed to all until he who bears the power to face the Backing up, try that again. This way is close to all until he comes who bears the power to face the dangers beyond. Rourke leaned down to kiss Helena, who was smiling in spite of her fear. I will not tell you not to worry, dear one, but if only for you, I will return. Then drawing the sword, he lifted his shield and stepped through the mirror. He felt the hilt of the sword tingle, and then he was inside. He stood on a desolate plain, stretching out in all directions. Before him was a small square stone marker with words written on it. You who have dared to pass through the barrier, prepare to meet the first peril. A circle of flame appeared before him, and through that circle came a man mounted on a great boar, wearing a breastplate of bronze and a spear of copper, bearing in his hand 3 javelins. He looked at the guardian and cried, Choose how you shall fight. Either match yourself without your shield, my steel without your sword, or both of us with sword and shield. Looking at them, Rourke considered the difficulty of fighting the boar bare-handed, or warding off javelins without a shield. He answered, I shall fight the 2 of you. With no further word, the man kicked at the boar's flanks, casting a javelin as they charged. Rourke warded the missile with his shield, dodging aside from the boar's slashing tusk, and swung a backhand blow as the animal went by. It was not a particularly solid blow, and it should rightly have only angered the animal. But Rourke felt a tingling in the sword's hilt, and the boar stumbled forward onto its knees, flinging the rider free, and suddenly flaring into blue flames. But the rider was up on his feet and whirling like a dancer. Rourke moved in quickly, shield up, and hurled his second javelin, which the guardian warded off. Then the boar rider leaped back and sideward, keeping well away from the sword. Now began a careful dance, the boar rider seeking to keep back from the sword, while looking for a sure opening for his javelin, as Rourke sought to close with him. It ended at last when the man found his angle and cast his javelin with such strength that it left him bent awkwardly. Rourke, unable to interpose his shield, bent and twisted his own body away from the missile. He avoided the worst of the blow, though it cut through his armor to gash his side just above the hip. But the guardian was back on balance soonest, and lunged forward to thrust with the sword. His opponent was just slow enough in moving that the tip of the sword touched his throat. The wound ought to have been no more severe than what a man might cause himself in shaving. But there was a blaze of blue flames, and the helmet and breastplate lay empty and discolored on the ground. Rourke stood still a moment, astonished, then recovered his wits enough to bandage his wound to the best of his ability. This done, he looked around. The desolate waste was still desolate and empty, but a path now led from the stone marker off toward the horizon. If that was there when I first arrived, muttered Rourke, I should best use my helmet as a beggar bowl and sit at the gates for a blind. He also considered how the fight had gone, and he realized that the power of the sword, which had absorbed the Hygerian magician's fireballs at Hardinian, had absorbed the magic which had produced the boar and its rider. It was a thing worth knowing. He wondered what might be the next test as he took a step along the path. It had been a strange sensation, and he now stood on a different road. a road which seemed to be a long continuous ribbon of stone. The sun in the sky was not yellow, but a deep violet, and it took his eyes some time to become familiar with it. Off to his left rear was a line of towers, towers built of metal bars, stretching out as far as he could see, and crossing the road at an angle before him to reach again to the horizon. He stepped forward. He stood in a clearing in a darkened wood, a low stone marker before him. On it he could read words, which glowed a little in the dimness. You have passed the first of the tests. Now you must spend the night in this forest. A test of your fears. He who fears nothing may survive. Rourke considered this, then smiled grimly. Yet it does not say that he will not survive who does show fear, who does know fear. He set out walking. He was immediately aware of the sound of feet moving in the woods about him, paralleling his path, following him, stalking ahead of him. When he stopped, the sound stopped, save for a steady approach of feet behind him. He hastened on. The movements around him continued. Suddenly, he found that he had broken into a run. All around him, the pursuers kept pace with him. The darkness was near complete now, and he suddenly ran full tilt into a low tree branch. His helmet saved him from more than a stunning blow and fall, and with it, he regained some degree of sense. He could not defend himself here on the trail should they decide to attack him, since the wood allowed them to approach him very closely without being seen. He began to go back down the trail to the clearing with the marker. He would have to fight his way past the one behind him, but if he were successful, his chances of survival would be much better. Things around him kept pace with him, and one had taken the trail at his rear again, but he neither saw nor heard the one he had expected to have to fight. He finally stumbled into the clearing again and stood by the stone marker, turning slowly to look in all directions, waiting for the first attack. It did not come immediately, though he saw no sign of the stalkers. He heard them gathering all around, heard them moving and shifting in the brush. Then, with still no attack, he decided to make a fire. It might serve to keep them back a little. Carefully, never letting the sword out of his hand, he gathered dry wood and leaves together. When he had enough, he squatted down and struck sparks until he had some of the dry leaves smoldering. He blew them into flames, then took up the sword again as he fed larger twigs, then sticks into the fire. Nothing had come out of the brush, though the sounds continued. Behind him was always the noise of something seeming to prepare to attack, and just when he thought they had burst into the clearing, he turned. Each time there was nothing, and the noise subsided. After this had happened several times, he was very tense, and each movement, which seemed nearer than the rest, almost caused him to jump. Then, directly in front of him, a beast emerged from the brush. It might have been some kind of lion refashioned by a madman, for the shape of the body was vaguely lion-like, and it had the head of a lion, but it was a gray dust color, and it had 3 pairs of legs, each ending in clawed feet. It charged him, emitting a noise midway between a growl and a roar, and sprang the last 10 feet. Rourke's action then was the fruit of much practice, and not from any considered thought. His shield came up to ward off the claws and fanged mouth, while the sword thrust for the gray beast's chest. The blow on the shield sent him staggering, and the sword was wrenched from his hand. He kept his feet, and when he had recovered his balance, he looked around to see the strange blue flames consuming the beast. Others like it were slinking out of the brush. His only weapon now was his dagger, for the sword was in the flaming chest of the first monster. Fear came on him, and the pack closed in. Something in his mind whispered, "Fight, you fool!" He drew his dagger, squared his shoulders, and said, "Grey pack, fierce pack, many fangs you bear. One tooth alone have I, with which to rend and tear. Only death you bring to me, my fears set aside. Who is the first to come to me, first to risk his hide?" There was hesitation now in the circle of monsters. Rourke laughed. "No, it was not my best poem. But then, can you truly judge? Come, I have a foot of steel here, enough for all of you. Perhaps even too much for one or two." The beasts howled together then, howls which seemed to bear the fruit of a note of frustration. Slowly they backed off into the brush again. For a time there was noise all around of heavy bodies crashing through the brush, then silence, save for the crackling of the fire. The carcass of the monster burned for some time, and the place remained too hot to approach for some time after that. When he was finally able to reclaim the sword, the beasts had still not yet attempted to return. He sat, his back against a stone marker, with the sword bare across his knees. A little while later he slept. In the morning, after a few moments spent stamping some of the stiffness out of his limbs, he set out along the road again. As he stepped past the marker, he wondered what new thing was in store for him. He was once more on the desolate plain, beneath the purple sun. Off to the right was a collection of what seemed to have once been buildings and of magnificent stature, perhaps a whole city. All of them had been smitten in some dreadful fashion. All were broken, shattered, tumbled in heaps. He wondered, as he took his next step along the road, what might have wrought such devastation. He stood before a huge wall, featureless, save for the holes which had formed hand and footholds in a line before him. Carven into the black rock at the level of his eyes were these words: "Choose now whether whether you shall take the shield proof against all, or attempt the coming tests without it." He thought a moment. From what he had already experienced, a shield proof against all ought to be invaluable for the rest of the tests. Yet he doubted that the shield would simply be there for the taking. Taking it would surely be another test itself. He began to climb the wall, watching warily for any trap, for any sign of someone waiting above. He came unmolested to the top of the wall. It was a good 10 yards wide and stretched out without break in both other directions as far as the eye could see. In the center, just ahead of him, a round shield was set into the surface of the wall. He looked at it as he approached. It was essentially the same as his own, though the upraised sword in the center of it was bright, as though newly painted. He bent to reach for it, but his fingers could not touch it. He straightened and saw a shimmer in the air before him. The shimmer thickened, darkened, and before he could guess at what it might be, it solidified into a man, fully 8 feet tall, well-muscled, wearing what appeared to be a cuirass of leather and a bronze helmet. He bore a rectangular shield on his left arm, and in his right he held an axe with a short, stout handle. When he spoke, his voice held a strange quality, as though it came from far away. I am here to guard the shield. In my hand I bear the axe, proof against all. You have made your choice, and may now go down alive with the shield, or dead without it. The axe swung up and down. Rourke brought his shield into position. The axe rent his shield as though it were made of cloth, and he barely managed to save his left arm. His return stroke missed. 3 more such blows left his shield a useless lump of ragged metal and wood. Dropping it, he avoided a blow of the axe and swung the sword. The other caught the blow on his shield, which buckled. The dread axe was descending, and Rourke parried with the sword. He felt the 2 weapons' edges jarring together, and was blinded by a flash of brilliant light. Then he was lying on his back, dazed, with no idea of how he'd come there. He sat up and found that he could neither feel nor move his right arm. The sword lay in front of him. A small blackened patch was on its blade. The axe, now a fused and blackened metal lump, lay near the sword, and just beyond it was the burned body of the shield's guardian, slain by a force unleashed at the meeting of the 2 weapons of power. Taking the sword in his left hand, Rourke stood. He approached the shield, which now seemed to lie loose on the stone surface of the wall. For a moment he looked around carefully, but there was no sign of anyone to further interfere. Though the feeling was coming back to his right hand slowly, he sheathed the sword clumsily with his left hand, then picked up the shield. He walked to the edge of the wall. He was once more on the road through the desolate plain, his right hand still holding the shield in place. He stood still, remembering how each step in this purple land had led him to the next test, and knowing that his right arm was not yet ready for any battle. He viewed his surroundings. On a hill to his left front, there were the remains of a single building, its walls standing jagged against the violet sky. The ground was pitted, and in some places held a glassy sheen. Strange machines lay around the building, broken and twisted. His fingers were now able to clasp the sword's hilt, so he stepped forward. He was facing a huge cliff, extending for miles in either direction. Just in front of him was a large fissure in the cliff, within which was a marker bearing these words: Hurry, O hero, for beyond this wall lies your destination. And yet, caution held him back. Further in, on the right-hand side, there was a deep cup-shaped depression with grooves leading downward, as though water running out of it over years of time had worn channels in the rock. He stepped in, thrusting the sword before him. He hesitated to see if anything should happen. And just as he was about to take the next step, a stream of liquid spurted from a hole in the left-hand side, striking the depression on the right. He watched as it hissed and smoked, and he could see the rock dissolving before his eyes. He had no need to wonder what might have happened had that liquid touched his flesh or his armor, and he knew now why the shield was necessary to this task. He was careful to hold the shield in such position that when the liquid spurted out, it ran down the face of the shield and did not drip onto him. As he reached the other end of the fissure, he breathed a deep sigh of relief. How many came here and stepped through without hesitation? Even the shield would not have protected me had I carried it less carefully. What strange place have I fallen into? He sighed again. Well, it seems to me that the nature of this place is such that I shall fight my way through through to the end or die. Therefore, let me be on my way, and if I am to die, let it be as near to the goal as I can manage. He stepped forward on the path leading out of the fissure. Before him, the long flat road led off to the beginning of some rolling hills, disappearing behind one gentle curve. The road, which seemed to have been made of one long piece of stone, was cracked and shattered a little further on, were remains of a train of wagons which seemed to have been traveling the road when the power struck. He shuddered and took the next step. Before him was a cave on a grassy hillside. A tall stone stood alone midway between the guardian and the cave. He approached it with caution. Upon it hung a brass horn, the shape and size of the horn of an ox, and there was a small brass plaque below it. Upon the plaque were the words, "This horn will summon a dragon from yonder cave. His longest fangs are keys which you will need, should you win to the end." Rourke laid his hand to the horn, then paused. It does not say that one must call the drake forth, and stand like a fool while it overruns one. Let me think. He looked around, and there seemed to be little of any use save for some twisted bushes. He walked to the cave. There was no immediate sign of the dragon, but the cave was deep, and he could not see to the rear. Frowning, he went back. He went to one of the clumps of brush and cut one of the straightest, stoutest poles, about 7 feet in length. He frowned, looked back at the cave, and shook his head. No, it will require a trifle more subtlety. He went back to the clump of brush and cut 4 more poles of about equal length with the first, then went to the clump and cut some more. He had 12 ready at last, and took 6 down to the mouth of the cave, where he set them into a shallow pit, hacked out with his dagger, then piled rocks on top. He already sharpened the ends to points. He moved a little further down the path out of the cave, where he planted the other poles similarly, save on the center one he tied his dagger. This was done. He went back and took when this was done, he went back and took the horn. Standing just behind the second line of stakes, he blew. After a moment, there was a scraping sound inside the cave. Then the dragon began to come out. The dragon paused first at the stakes, then pushed against them, snapping them off with no harm to his hide. He came forward swiftly now, and Rourke began to back away, as though in fear. The drake charged, heedless, into the second row of stakes, and even as the wood splintered, he flung back his head and gave a hissing scream of pain. Now, Rourke moved forward. As the dragon thrashed about, the guardian ran up the slope beside the cave until he was level with the dragon's body. For all the pain of his wound, the dragon was still dangerous. He turned his head and belched out a gout of flame which Rourke, who had expected something of the sort, caught mostly on his shield. Then the guardian leaped, landing astride the long and scaly neck. Locking his legs around the neck, he hewed with the sword, The blow did little more than break a scale or two. He cut again with little better success, then flung aside his shield to take the sword in both hands. By now, the drakes writhing and bucking were so frenzied that the guardian had to hold on with his arms as well as his legs. For a time, it was all he could do to keep his place. Then, for a moment, the dragon paused. Rourke took the sword in both hands and struck. He managed 2 blows before the drake heaved again, sending him flying. The landing knocked the breath from him, so that while he knew he had to move, he was unable to do more than twist around to look at the beast. But the dragon did not attack. He continued to writhe, scream, and paw his chest. Suddenly, he fell, but was up a moment later, still screaming, pawing at his chest. Rourke held back. Clearly, his trap with the dagger was working, and it did not seem necessary to risk his life by closing with the beast. He had wounded it in the neck, which is also having an effect, and the dragon seemed not to be interested in avenging itself on the man who had caused its pain. It took a long while before the dragon was dead, and it took Rourke a little while longer to remove the 2 longest teeth, as the instructions on the plaque demanded. Then, having recovered his dagger as well, with all things ready, he stepped out on the path. On the road ahead of him was a long line of wagons, destroyed, and in most cases decayed, with whitened skeletons lying among them, with what might have been bundles of clothing and valuables. Rourke took his next step. The violet light of sun shone on a gray stone castle. It seemed to have been hewn from a single huge block of stone, for Rourke could see no joining of stone on its surface. The huge double gate was locked with a padlock the size of his hand, and above it was a brass plate, which he could read when he approached. Bold and prudent hero, here is the last of the tests. In the central tower is the power which blocks the pass, but the castle is guarded by the dead. Enter and prepare to fight. The padlock had 2 round holes in it, one above the other. Rourke put one of the dragon's teeth into one of the holes and heard a click. He inserted the other tooth into the other hole, and the lock fell open. He removed it and pushed on the gate. As it swung open, he drew the sword and stepped in. All around the courtyard stood or sat a number of skeletons, armed with shield, sword, spear, or axe. Even as he stepped in, they became aware of him. Heads turned toward him, and those sitting rose, while those standing drew weapons and moved toward him. Warily he watched them. Suddenly, the nearest one leaped at him, sword swinging. He caught the blow on his shield, and his return stroke went through the skeleton's guard to bite into its bleached ribs. He felt a tingling in his hand, and the skeleton fell to the courtyard in a heap of disconnected bones. He realized then that the sword was able to counter the magic that had animated the skeletons, just as it had negated the magic of the Hygerian sorcerer at Hardinian. He moved toward a wall where he could stand with his back protected. He had to fight 2 of the skeletons before he arrived there, and his opponents attacked with a silent ferocity, possessing a weapon skill only slightly hindered by their hint of slowness. Then, with 10 of their number downed, the rest fell back into a small watchful semicircle. Rourke, with several light wounds, leaned on the sword and breathed heavily. After a moment, still leaning negligently on the sword, he sang a small, mocking song. Swift are the swords under the violet sun. Come to me, dead ones, the battle's not done. Which bony foe will next be stilled? For Arvendel's sons are not easily killed. Come then, come. I've not the whole day. Let there be an ending to our play. This little exercise can do no harm. Perhaps the sun is a little too warm. As though in answer, the castle's grim guardians began to move once more to the attack. The Rourke had been considering his own strategy. It'd be too easy for them to pen him in here against the wall and wear him down. He leaped forward to meet the first of them, shield to shield, bowling that one over into the next one behind him and making a path through them. 2 more blows gave him a clear space through which he ran for the tower. He had no expectation of outrunning them all, merely getting enough of a start to be able to deal with a few of them at a time. He whirled suddenly, the sword swinging in a huge backhand, which beat back the skeleton's shield far enough that the edge of the sword struck the breastbone, sapping the magic force from within it. 2 others were coming in at once. He thrust the sword at one, kicking out hard at the other. Whatever power directed them was becoming wary of the sword, for while his kick sent the one stumbling backward, the other flung himself aside from the flickering blade. Rourke himself jumped back, turned, and ran again for the tower. He raised the sword and brought it down in a blow containing all the strength he could muster. The door cracked. He drew back, but the nearest of his foes was almost upon him. He turned to fight. He fought with all the skill he possessed, and twice he leaped away from the blows to fall against the door, which cracked under his weight. Then one of his attackers charged heedlessly against him, and as he staggered backward against it, the door broke. He barely regained his balance, and a quick blow dispatched the skeleton which had fallen inside with him, and he was able to stand. He came up quickly enough to prevent the next one from coming in. At the threshold, he made his stand. They could come through only one at a time, and he met each one stepping through. It was not easy, though the skeletons were slow. They were many, and after a time, Rourke lost the advantage of quickness he had had at the start. His limbs weighed like iron, and the piled bones hindered his feet. Though he had kicked as many of them aside as he was able, 3 times he was forced back far enough from the doorway that 1 or 2 other skeletons could come in, but each time desperation strengthened him enough to defeat them and hold the door again. As he stepped to the door after the 3rd time, he found no more opposition. He leaned against the door jamb, breathing heavily. Powers above, I'm in little better case than they. His chain shirt hung in rags. His right leg was gashed twice, badly. His right arm cut twice, but not so badly. His helmet was dented, the crest sheared off, and the sight of his right eye was obscured by blood flowing from a cut above it. He had several other small cuts about him, and his head swam. He turned and fell upon the steps. Rising, he began to stagger upward toward the circling stair, faint, sickening, with his only determination holding him upright. He made his way to the top of the tower. Another wooden door stood before him, and when he pushed it open, he found a small room, empty, before a table in the middle. Directly across from him was a window, which looked out onto the path by which he had come. He looked at the table and saw, as for the first time, a large crystal sphere on top of it. Within the crystal was a spark of violet, which became brighter as he watched. growing to an angry red. The color was changing swiftly now. It was a searing white. He sensed a danger here, and having no other way to fight, he covered his face with his shield against the light and stepped forward, striking at the crystal. As the sword struck, there was a bright blue flash, and he was flung against the wall. He felt the building begin to tremble, and as he turned toward the door, the building collapsed. He was standing upon the gap between the mountains, on the green grass, with the yellow sun above. There was an encampment of Icarians before him, and he heard the shouts of alarm and surprise just before he fell unconscious. Dun dun dun! But like I said, that was a meaty one today. Yeah. So I really appreciate everyone for tuning in and for sticking with me for this long, long ride. him, him, him. It's been a long day at work, so I pardon my voice as it's like cracking and everything. But yeah, so that's everything for tonight. I really like this chapter. It's actually very similar to the other book. So, and this one's always been one of my favorite because it's where all the magic happens and just sort of the real adventure gets in. So, yeah, it's my favorite chapter of it. I mean, there gets to be more stuff later on. I think I'm not sure. It depends on what how this differs from the old book, but we'll see. Yeah, so I will talk to you all again tomorrow night. Um, have a good night, and thank you for tuning in. Good night.